Okay, friends, it looks like my go live button is on, so I'm just going to test a couple of things. All right, if you can see and hear me, just please let me know in the comments. If you will go ahead and introduce yourself, welcome. It is 8:21, and I have verified that I can hear you on my other computer. So looks like we're ready to go. Welcome. Let me see who I see out there already. We have, let's see, we have Vicky and Marcy and Diana. Hi everybody. It is a little bit rainy here, and so welcome to another Sewing Sunday with the Jelly Roll Club. Today we are starting to wind down our Gnome of the Month. So we are working on our September gnome. So his name is Norm. Norm is a fun little guy, and so he loves to hang out in the apple orchard. And let me show you some stuff about Norm, and let's talk about felt applique. So today we're going to do a couple of things. I'm going to talk about applique with felt. There's a couple of methods that you can use to applique with felt. I'm going to talk about the pros and the cons of using natural wool felt versus like acrylic craft felt. Hi, Brenda from Louisville. And I'm also going to talk about how to piece together your finished applique and kind of how to take it on the road. And so you can applique with felt either by machine or by hand. Either way works. So let's get started. All right, if you have any questions, please drop those in the chat. I'll be happy to let you know. I will pause every so often and look in my chat so that I can see what's happening. And okay, I'm going to switch my camera view so you can see my hands. And welcome, everybody. All right, so first is first. So we have the pattern that you should have downloaded. And it's a little bit blurry, let me see. So this is the Gnome of the Month. Let me turn my light because it's a little bit bright. There we go. And so the Gnome of the Month for today is Norm. Norm loves to play in his tree swing, and he loves apples. And so he's a happy little guy, right? He's a short little man. And this month, you should be making 2 blocks in order to finish your 20 block quilt. But I have a couple of accessories here that I put in the Gnome of the Month handout, and I will show you how to use these. And then you have your line drawings for our little guy, and then you should have a tree. And this is for your optional block. So you can use him for this, or you can use him in one of your optional blocks as a filler with something across the bottom. So let me show you what we've got. All right, so first let's talk about applique with felt, right? And so what I have already started is I've already cut out all of my little Norm parts, right? And I've used, for this particular gnome, I have used craft felt. So you can actually make this entire block using craft felt. Now, I only recommend craft felt if it's something that you're going to be washing by hand, so like a door hanger, and that's what he's going to become for me. So he's going to be a little door hanger for my classroom. And so if you're not going to wash him all of the time, craft felt works perfectly fine. Wool felt is made with natural fibers. It's made with animal hair, and it withstands a lot higher heat than craft felt. Acrylic felt can melt on you, so you have to be careful with acrylic felt. But you can certainly make decorative pillows with acrylic felt. I would not recommend it for an entire quilt that you're going to want to put in the washing machine because it curls up on you, especially if you put it in the dryer. So acrylic felt is okay for wall hangings and other stuff, but if you're making a quilt that you want to actually use on a bed or launder regularly, then my recommendation is for you to use actual natural wool felt for that. And it's not cheap, so get out there and experiment with some wool felt. I'm going to be doing a series next year of woolies, so I'm going to make little wool mats next year. So next summer, if you're interested in woolies, I will be working on a whole series of woolies. All right, so let's talk about how to put together a felt applique. So as you can tell, I've already started putting all of my pieces together, and I've cut them out using the freezer paper method. So I took all of my pieces, and so this is the shiny side of the freezer paper. I put this on my pattern, and I traced every one of the pieces using this pattern, right? And so you have to remember, if you're using the freezer paper method, you're going to want to flip this over and use a light box and trace them on the back side, because the freezer paper actually gets adhered to the front. So if I were to trace this like this, it would end up mirror image. So you trace these out using freezer paper because it doesn't leave an adhesive, and then with your iron you press the freezer paper to the front of your applique piece, and then you simply cut it out. Once my applique pieces are all cut out, then I start putting together this little composite guide. And how I put together my composite guide was using washable school glue. Lisa said you can't find freezer paper anywhere where you live. If you cannot find freezer paper anywhere where you live, you can always cut out the pattern pieces like this that you have printed and just simply pin them down or staple them onto your felt. So if you can't find freezer paper, you can certainly cut these pieces out and staple them down onto your felt, cut them out, and then remove the staples. So that's another way of doing it if you cannot find freezer paper. So once I cut them out using freezer paper, then I put them together using a little bit of 100% washable, and this is washable type. There's two types. There's a gel type and there's a stick type. And I like this because it's 100% washable, so it doesn't leave any residue, and once you wash your pieces, it comes completely out. But since this is going to be a wall hanging, I'm not super concerned. But I'm going to take this washable school glue, and you're simply going to use a little bit of sandpaper, which is what I have here, and I lay my piece wrong side down, and I'm going to put glue all over my pieces like this. And I use the sandpaper because it keeps that from sliding. And so I put a generous amount of glue, and I'm going to put all of these together just like that. And I'm butting up that against the edge. I'm not overlapping it. So I'm trying to not overlap my pieces because overlapping creates bulk. And so in traditional applique, you layer those pieces under each other. Using this method, I'm simply pushing that against that piece. And so I'm going to push that down. If I want to hit it with a little bit of parchment paper that you use for baking, I can always give it a little tiny bit of heat, not much, just to help that glue stick. But I'm going to push it down really hard because I want to put pressure on it. One of the ways that you can put pressure on it as well is simply lay your wooden ironing board on top of it, and you can put pressure that way. But I like to put a little bit of glue and then push him down. So I put together my entire gnome before I do anything else, and the same with the feet. So the feet I have cut with a little overlap, but when I get ready to anchor those feet, I will trim the excess. And so let me show you how this works. So this is the bottom, right? I have him here. I'm going to attach this to the bottom, and then I'm going to overlap it just ever so slightly under here. So I'm going to go ahead and pin this in place to my backing. And then I'm going to glue this guy in place. So I'm going to put a generous amount, that's why I have a giant glue stick. And I like the purple one because I can see where the glue is going. And I'm going to put just a generous amount of that glue, and I'm going to press it down. Just on the bottom part, because what I want is for this to stay in place when I start either machine sewing or hand sewing the entire piece. Up here where the beard is, I'm going to do the same thing. Just going to put a big generous amount of glue. Can you see the purple glue? If your pieces slide, you can always put a sandpaper board underneath your entire thing. And I'll show you what my sandpaper board looks like. If you're an appliquer, you've probably seen these sandpaper boards, but if this is your first time, then you may have not seen them. So my sandpaper board looks like this. It's just a big square. It's kind of shiny on one side, and on the other it has a big square of sandpaper. And so this little guy, gets little bits on it, is great for laying your entire applique on, because then it keeps it from sliding around. You can also use the sandpaper for putting glue on your big pieces like this one. So once I lay that down, and that's the grass, right, it won't move anymore. And so I can take this glue and I won't be stretching my pieces, because my goal is to glue this entire grassy knoll here without putting any pressure on my felt. If you're using wool felt, or if you have used wool felt for crafts before, you can stretch natural felt or acrylic felt to the point where it gets little holes in it. And so you're just going to use that sandpaper board or a piece of sandpaper. You can pin it to your wool mat. And so I'm going to put that grassy knoll down here where it belongs, and I'm going to apply some pressure. So I have trimmed the grassy knoll enough that it's not going to overlap very much. And so hang on. I'm going to push it just like that. And so I'm pushing that up against the body. You see that? So there's very little overlap. Now my little feet are going to end up coming right on top. And if I wanted to reduce the bulk, I could always trim those little feet. And so I'm going to lift that because I want to tuck those feet just barely up against there. A pair of very small sharp scissors is great for this kind of work, because you're going to need your little pieces to kind of butt up against each other like that. And that looks really nice. And if I wanted to trim these feet, because these feet look kind of big, because I made him barefoot this time instead of the normal way, so I can always just trim those little feet a little bit, because he's a barefoot gnome. But regardless of what scissors you use, make sure they're very, very sharp, so that you get nice clean edges. You see how those edges are nice and clean? And so there's a little foot now. That looks like a more proportional foot. And so don't be afraid to take a pattern and change it up. Like I said, I decided that I wanted Norm to be barefoot. And so because he's going to be barefoot, I need to change the size of his feet, right? He's not wearing shoes. So there we go. I made his feet a little bit smaller. And now I'm going to put those little feet and glue them in place. Why am I gluing the entire thing on here? Because first of all, I want to make sure that everything is perfectly anchored and it's not going to shift. So if you decide that you want to do a blanket stitch with your sewing machine, you can. But if you put everything down and you glue it very well in place, then he won't be shifting around. Okay? And so there I have it. I have his little feet. And I might decide I want arms. I haven't decided yet, because I might be putting other stuff around him. And so now that I have my guy, and as you can see, there's like a little bump there. If you don't cut smooth, you can always just come back and trim. So now those little feet are ready. Okay? I have his big hat, And so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to glue that down as well, and I'm going to glue the feet in place once I like how the feet look. I'm going to take these and I'm going to put them on a bit of sandpaper. And I'm going to put glue on the back. And I'm going to push that down into place just like that, so that there's no overlap, they're just butting up against each other. Does that make sense, what I've explained so far? Does anybody have any questions about how to put together your little gnome using felt? So this is how you would put together this guy. You can put together flowers and bumblebees and all kinds of cute little critters. So you can take any of the elements that I shared with you in the gnome series, and you could actually take and turn them into woolies. Okay, so now that I have the feet glued down, I'm going to put a little bit of pressure. And so I like to take my wooden board and just kind of push down with my hands and put some pressure. Sometimes I'll put a heavy book on it and just leave it. And that way, when I'm ready to go on the road, if I want to do this as handwork, I can just take it on the road and all of my pieces will stay together. You can stick it in a little gallon-size Ziploc bag and he's ready to go. Okay, last but not least, I'm going to flip him upside down and I'm going to glue his entire hat. I'm just going to put glue across the top and glue across this part of his hat. And like I said, don't worry about being generous with that glue because this is washable school glue and it'll come right out. Okay. All of that's glued into place. If you feel more comfortable putting a few staples in there with a stapler, then your piece will be travel ready. Mine is going to have a very, very skinny border. Once I'm done, I'm going to trim him up and I'm going to turn him into a door hanger for my classroom. So now that you've created your little felt applique, and like I said, you can make these guys with acrylic felt, but it's for non-washable projects. So if you're going to just maybe hand wash them to clean and then use them as a door hanger or a decorative element, or even put them on a wreath, you could do it that way. But if you want something that's washable and more durable, you're going to want to use 100% natural wool felt. So let's talk about the most common way to anchor these pieces once they're here, right? The most common way is to simply take a single strand of matching thread and you do something called a whip stitch that's about a 1/16 of an inch away from the edge and it comes across. And let me show you what that looks like. So I found a little bit of beige, right? I'm going to start in the center with the nose. And I'm using a single strand. You can do double, but I think single is plenty. And I'm going to do a traditional quilter's knot, just like that. And that makes that little tiny knot. I still have glue on my fingers, so let me get that off. And then coming from the back, I'm simply going to come in from the edge about a 1/16 of an inch. Can you guys see that? From the edge. Now, I could certainly finish this entire thing on my sewing machine. So you do not have to sew it by hand at all. This entire thing could be sewn now on the sewing machine using a walking foot or using a free motion foot, and you could do any decorative stitch on your sewing machine. And so now I come to do that whip stitch, right? I come in about a 1/16 of an inch and I go back down. And this gets tangled, so you have to kind of watch it. That beard's going to be the death of me. So I'm going to pin this down. If I wanted to staple this down, it would probably be easier, but I'm just going to pin it in place to keep it from flapping up. And so in the back, I'm just going to come, and I'm going to come in 1/16 of an inch. And the key to this is that the thread matches and that the stitching is consistent. So you just come in at 1/16 of an inch. Do you see that? Away from the edge. And you take another little stitch, and then you bring it down. And so with wool applique or felt applique, the biggest challenge that you're going to have is keeping all of those little stitches even and not pulling too tight. If you pull too tight, then it creates little divots in the felt, and if you make little divots in the felt, it's going to sink those little pieces. So you pull, but not too tight. And so you're just gently pulling, and you're sewing 1/16 of an inch away from those edges. And so 1/16 of an inch away from the edge, and about 1/4 of an inch distance along the perimeter. And you're just coming, and you're going to see that those stitches are literally invisible sometimes. Now you could, if you wanted to, stitch with decorative thread. You could use metallic threads. You could do any kind of embroidery thread that you wanted. And don't cut your threads too long. Do you see what happened to me there? I didn't use thread conditioner, and that thread was too long, and now it got a knot. And that happens, right? So you just carefully pull that to avoid that. There you go. And so you just keep going all the way around, and you can barely even see those stitches. So those stitches are literally almost invisible. Do you see those? So it's 1, 2, 3, 4. But as long as you're consistent, then you're going to be okay. And so this is my little guy, right? He's made out of felt. And like I said, he's going to be a little door hanger, because I like using these little guys as door hangers. And so I'm just going to continue all the way around, about 1/16 of an inch from the inside to the outside. Super easy. It's to sew right through that felt. It's very relaxing, really. Once you put your little felt buddies together, you can sit in front of the TV and you could literally do this for hours. And that's how you would do it. You would just sew all the way around your felt buddy. Does anybody have any questions about my little felt guy? And so this is how I would do it if I didn't want to flatten his edges. So let's talk about sewing by machine. If I were sewing this little guy by machine, I would be using a stitch length with a, so let's just say that you're doing a decorative blanket stitch. If you're doing a decorative blanket stitch, you're going to want that decorative blanket stitch to be about a 3.0 length, right? And about a 2.5 wide. And so that gives you a little tiny blanket stitch that fits this one. You don't have to do a blanket stitch at all. You can actually just straight stitch all the way across his nose with just a regular sewing machine. So like on my sewing machine back here, I'm just using a straight stitch. And so you don't have to do a decorative stitch at all. But I do recommend using a matching thread if you're going to sew. So for me, I find it easier to use embroidery floss and embroidery needles when I'm sewing, because there's so many more choices of embroidery floss, and it's cheaper than buying tons of spools of thread. So for example, all of these greens, I only paid like $5 for a bundle of greens online. It's like $5.99. So when you're doing wool, I suggest you buy embroidery floss to sew your appliques down, because you get so many more fabric choices, and there's things like metallics that are fabulous. All right, so somebody asked a question. Let me see. Let me stop and answer questions at this point. So I like to use embroidery floss, but you can certainly use cotton thread in your machine, or you can use decorative threads. And you can do anything that you want, as long as you remember that when you have wool, that you don't have your pieces overlap. They push up against each other, so you may have to trim them if your pattern is designed for traditional fusible applique. Okay? So on the picture there are 2.5 apples. Which one? Let me see. There's an apple here. These right here. So this is your pattern, right? And so I'm going to show you how to cut an apple. So if I wanted to put an apple next to this guy, I'm going to show you the freezer paper method for the apple, okay? So let me show you how to make an apple. Okay, so this is my freezer paper, right? And for this apple, you can see I don't need a light box. So I'm going to set an apple right where he's at. I'm simply going to take and I'm going to draw the apple like this. There's going to be a stem, but I will use embroidery floss to add that stem. And there's a leaf, and I'll use felt for that leaf. So I'm just going to do my apple for now. And this is on the dull side of my freezer paper. This is the shiny side. So I've got my apple, and I'm going to take, this is wool felt that I have in red, so I'm going to pull some of this wool felt that I have by the yard, and I'm simply going to take, and let me move this out of the way, and I have my apple. Can you guys see that? I'm going to do less exposure. Okay, so there's my apple all cut out. I'm going to take a little bit of parchment paper or baking paper, right? This is just a piece of parchment paper that I've used a dozen times. And I'm going to put my wool felt in there. I'm going to trim around it. And so this is the freezer paper method. Now I'm going to lay that parchment paper, so I'm going to sandwich it together. Are you talking about the sliced apple that was on the thumbnail? Is that what you're looking for? Let me look on the website, okay? So let me just take a moment to look on the website. Okay, so I'm going to the website now to look and see if I can find the half apple. Oh, you're talking about the half apples on his hat, right? Is this the half apple you're talking about? These little guys? Okay, I'll show you how to make those. So this is the big apple, and let me finish showing you that, and then I will show you how to make the little half apples. Okay. All right, so there we go. I have ironed it. I'm going to trim this off, and I will show you how to make the little half apples. Okay, so the whole apple is like this, and I'm just going to trim him up, and this is the freezer paper on top. When you cut, try to take long strokes. There we go. And so now I can just simply peel that freezer paper, and there's no glue on my applique piece. And so this guy will go down here on the ground beside him. So I'm going to put an apple down there. Okay? If I wanted to put apples on his head, just like the little apples on here, right, I will simply take some of that freezer paper, and you can see the apples right through the freezer paper. You don't need a special pattern. And then you're simply going to take a pen or a pencil, and you're going to do the same thing. You're going to trace those little apple pieces like this. Looks like a little heart almost. Just like that, and you're going to do the same thing that I just did. We're going to cut that out. Looks like two little half hearts. And you're going to take that little half apple and you're going to put it on. So let's just say I'm going to use tan, right? So the inside of that apple is tan. I could do the same thing I just did. Simply take my parchment paper. There we go. Lay it in between, just like a little sandwich. And you can see I use this parchment paper a lot. I'm going to give it a little press. And it sticks just like that. That's why I like to use freezer paper. And then you take itty bitty scissors. I have a huge collection of itty bitty scissors because I use them so much. Look, how many little scissors do I have? Quite a few. But you can take any scissors that has a little sharp point, go into that point like that. And you have something small, go into the point like this. The reason you want to do that is so you get a nice point in there, and then you're going to come through the curve like this, turning it with your finger, and it gives you a much smoother piece. Then you start over here. And get to the other side, and that gives you that little heart shape for your little apple. And now you have a little apple that you can now anchor to the hat. With a little bit of glue, and then you're going to use your embroidery floss to add seeds. And if you want a little red outline to that apple, then you simply lay it on a piece of red. So if you wanted to outline that apple, you have two options. You could either use red embroidery floss to add the detail, or you could lay it on top of a little bit of red and create a layered applique. So you could layer it together, make it a little bit bigger, just like that. And you could stitch it down with a nice tight stitch so that you have red around your little apple. So if you wanted your apple, see how the apple has a little bit of red? I'm just going to take and trim this like this. And then you could use a nice tight stitch, trim it up to have an apple shape. You have to sometimes take little tiny trims when it's when working with wool. Sometimes you have to take little tiny sharp trims, just like that, allowing it to have the little apple shape. And now it would be ready for me to applique down, and you could put a stem and some seeds. Does that make sense? How you would build your little apple to put on his hat? And so he would need a couple of seeds, right? So I would use probably for those seeds, I buy usually DMC or pearl cotton. You could use some of this. And let me get some of this pearl cotton out. Pearl cotton is a little bit thicker, but it's more economical sometimes if you're going to be doing a lot of black outlining. So I just need a bigger needle for that. So I use this big needle right here. Who else sticks their thread in their mouth? I do. Flatten that out and shove it through the hole. Or, when all else fails, you can always find your threader, right? Nothing like live TV and not having your threader. Oh well. Here, so I'm going to flatten that out. When all else fails, put your glasses on. There we go. So much more helpful when I can see the little thing. Anybody else learn to flatten their embroidery floss with their teeth? Alright, so now that I have that pearl cotton, I'm going to do the same thing. Do 3 loops. I don't want big giant knots on the back side of my applique. And so it just makes a little knot. And then I would take and I would come all the way through the back. And I'm going to anchor this with a seed. So I'm going to do an apple seed, right? If you notice how shifty it can be, these can shift around on you, so you've got to glue them down really, really well. And so I've got it anchored with that apple seed on one side, and then I'm going to anchor it with an apple seed on the other side. Is that what you guys wanted to see, the little apple, little half apple? Okay. So now that I've got it anchored, I'm going to pull it tight. If you notice, I left this long tail. The reason I left this long tail is because I like to come in and tie it off like this. And then I like to trim this off because I don't want big knots on the back. And so even though it has a little tail, I'd rather have a tail than a big knot because you can start to feel those on the other side. Okay, so now I have the 2 little seeds, and I'm going to make those seeds bigger on my apple by coming in here, right beside there. So I went right adjacent to where the hole was, and I'm going to make that apple seed bigger. I'm going to come down through that hole. And now my apple seed looks like that. I'm going to come in on the other side, and I'm going to make right beside there, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to make that apple seed bigger. And as you can see, when you're working with wool, it can be very slippery. It can get away from you. So you have to really anchor it down, staple it down, glue it down, however you're going to get that anchored. And so now I have the 2 little seeds for my apple half, and now I'm going to come in with beige, so around this little apple that's open, and then I'm going to come around this and then build a stem. And so that's how I would put the little apple on his hat. It said if you put the eye of the needle in your mouth, the thread will go through it better than wetting. Oh my gosh, thank you, Sue. I'm going to try that. So this is how you would build your little gnome if you wanted to build him using felt. Have you guys ever used felt before? Is that something that you want to try? I'm definitely going to be doing more wool. I've been playing with woolies, and I'm going to be doing a lot of wool applique next year. So that's on my to-do for next year. In addition to my to-do for next year of woolies, we're going to be doing a row runner of the month. And the row runner of the month is a quilt that's built with rows. If you want to take those rows and turn them into a single table runner, you could certainly do that. And so that's why it's called the row runner quilt. And then you can take each row and start building a quilt, and by the end of the year you're going to have an entire quilt, or you're just going to take the row and turn it into a table runner. And so 2023 is going to be the row runner of the month. And so you're going to see that happening next year. But yeah, wool is a fun thing to play with. It's actually more forgiving than you realize, but that's how you put the little apple on there. Then you would just take some beige, and you could actually just anchor the beige little part of that little apple to the red by doing a quilter's knot. You pull it, and then you take that quilter's knot and then you bring that behind this wool applique here. I'm going to anchor that little tiny beige part of the apple to the red. Just go right through there. And just anchor that to the red. You could tie a knot in the back if you want to secure it that way. And then I'm going to tuck that in there, out of the way, and then I'm just literally going to go all the way around. You're pushing it tight with your thumb, and you're allowing the thread to just come up. It's so easy to sew, but you're not going to pull it tight, because if you pull it tight, you're distorting your felt. So you're just going to pull it and come in from the side. It's like a little whip stitch, where you go up and down, up and down, up and down. And then on the side, I'm going to keep doing that until my little apple is anchored from the center out. And anytime you're building a felt applique that has multiple layers like this one, you build from the center to the outside. I could have cut just a little rim of an apple and put it on there, but just like this, I'm taking it, I'm pushing it down, and I'm sewing all the way around that little baby apple. Just like that. I like the look of felt. It has like a very dimensional kind of texture to it. So especially if you're working with something like these little gnomes that are just kind of whimsical, they lend themselves to like decorative objects. Super easy and fun. Look at that. So as you can see, that those little apple edges are now sinking down into, oh, can you guys see that? The little edges that are kind of fuzzy are now sinking down into the red. And then you simply take and you stitch the little red down and then add a little stem or a leaf if you want to. Okay? And so that is it. Super easy. It seems harder than what it actually is. It's not. You may have to re-glue from time to time because you're holding it, but I like using glue because it's, like I said, it washes right out. It doesn't leave any residue on my applique pieces, and it holds them into place so that you don't get frustrated with your pieces shifting all over the place. So working with felt is a lot easier than you realize. Don't be afraid to do it. Like I said, easy peasy. And that's it. All right, now it is 2:43, and on my announcement I said that I would talk about bobbin work. And so I'm going to be doing an entire separate video on how to add bobbin work details to your blocks. But basically, bobbin work detail is where you take your bobbin, just like this, on your sewing machine, and you simply wind thread that's too thick to go through the eye of the needle of the sewing machine. So you can use ribbon, you can use embroidery floss, pretty much anything that you want to use. So if I have my big thing of embroidery floss, I could simply wind it if I wanted to, or some of this pearl cotton, and I would simply wind it by hand in my bobbin because I'm going to sew with my piece upside down. So bobbin work means that you're sewing with your decorative piece face down and you're sewing from the back side. And so you would simply take and you would wind this nice thick embroidery floss on your bobbin. You would wind it by hand. Like I said, you can do just about anything. You could do ribbon, You can do anything you want, and you would stick it into your bobbin just like this. You would wind it by hand and trim it. And you can now sew with this thick thread in your bobbin, and you're going to flip your piece from the back side, and you're going to follow the drawn line. So if I wanted to add decorative stitching, you could use yarn or anything in my bobbin. I could do that to add details. So if I wanted to add vines, or if I wanted to add details to my leaves, if I wanted to add anything in the background with nice thick thread, including yarn, I could do that by putting it into my bobbin. So if you're interested in me doing an entire video on just bobbin work, please let me know. I would be happy to do that for you guys, but it is 2:45. So if you don't have any other questions on how to get started with your little guy, I am ready to just sew him down, like I said, either by machine or by hand, and that is how you work with felt. Things that you are handy are a little bit of sandpaper, glue sticks, tiny scissors for cutting, freezer paper, but if you cannot find freezer paper, then you can just literally pin or staple your pieces right on top. And if you really wanted to, if you're using natural wool felt, you could actually even do it with fusible web on the back if you're using natural felt. All right, friends, that's all for now. If you guys want me to do an entire video just on bobbin work, showing you different kinds of materials inside your bobbin, like yarn or ribbon, let me know, and I can do an entire video on just bobbin work, because I'm going to be doing bobbin work to add details to some of the blocks I've already finished. So if you're interested, let me know, and I'll try to put that up in the next couple of weeks. Okay? All right, friends, I hope you got an introduction to working with wool. I hope you will enjoy this series. Take the time to get out there and smell the apples. Enjoy the fresh air, because it's going to start getting cold in just a couple of months, and then we're all going to be trapped inside. But have a wonderful afternoon. I hope you learned great things. It's so nice to see you guys online, and I will be back in a couple of weeks, because we have Dresden of the month. All of 2023, we're going to have the row quilt, so we're going to have the monthly row, and so we've got lots of other things to finish. I've got some surprises for those who love applique, and I've got surprises for those who love piecing. So quilting is my obsession and my hobby, but I hope you guys have a wonderful afternoon. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done that, so that you get all of my notices and my pictures and all the stuff I post. All right, friends, have a great afternoon. I hope you make beautiful things. I'll talk to you guys later, okay? Bye, friends.